Are you a soup enjoyer? Do you just love a bowl of hot, delicious, liquidy goodness? Maybe you like to have a lot of veggies in there, or maybe you like a little bit of chicken or some other meats with plenty of spices all simmered in. Maybe you're a little rebellious and you prefer a chili or a gazpacho. Regardless of your preference for soup, today's deck feels like the soup deck of Pioneer. Niv-Mizzet has a smorgasbord of spells and big, chunky creatures to fill your tummy with wholesome magic goodness. Today, we'll walk through the ingredients in the list, including some sideboard spice, and take a look at how it stacks up against the rest of the metagame on the menu, and what your best tasting lines and play patterns with this deck will look like. Now, I'm sure the soup analogy does seem a little bit weird, but that exact moniker has been thrown around ever since these multicolor toolbox mid-range style decks have burst onto the scene. Taking a lot of individually good parts and cooking them together ends up giving you a powerful combination of cards that function like a mid-range deck's greatest hits from each of the color pairings that you have in there. The best example of these decks being incredibly strong would be the Uro piles that took over Modern and Standard and even Pioneer back in its heyday, or the Omnath piles that have kind of stayed a consistent fixture in formats like Modern since the card has been printed. Decks like this became so oppressive to deck diversity specifically that some cards had to eat the banhammer, but these decks have still floated around in tier 2 limbo for quite some time. The added fact that we keep going to two color planes like Ravnica over and over again only keeps adding to the powerful number of dual colored haymakers, giving these decks a breath of fresh air every 3 months or so. And why choose a few of your favorite guilds when you can use the living guild packed avatar dragon symbol itself of the plane to play all of them? So before we dive into the recipe, I do want to make one note that this is a Yorion deck. So we're going to be going through all 95 potential cards in our list. The main draw to adding Yorion here is just this sheer number of 1 and 2 of cards that we can put into our deck, combined with the ability we have to search for them at any given point in time when we have the spells. We're also able to run all 5 colors, so the extra slots for lands are greatly appreciated. Now, the namesake of the deck has evolved over time, but centers around the card Bring to Light. This 5 mana sorcery comes complete with a Simic Guild mana cost and the Zendikar mechanic Converge, which cares about the different number of colored mana we've paid to cast the spell. Since our deck covers every single guild on Ravnica, that means our deck is capable of a minimum of 2, maximum of 5 Converge cost. Bring to Light allows us to tutor for a creature, instant or sorcery, and cast that card for free, so as long as its CMC is less than or equal to our Converge cost. That means this is often just 5 mana spell that tutors for pretty much anything in our deck that isn't an artifact or enchantment, which is a lot of stuff. One of those said targets in our deck is the other part of the deck's name, Niv-Mizzet Reborn. The OG Atraxa effect before Phyrexians made it popular, Niv's 6/6 flying body might be a little bit smaller and less wordy than Atraxa's keywords, but we get to do something very similar and equally as powerful in a deck crafted the way ours is. We reveal the top 10 cards of our deck, and for each color pair, we get to choose a card among them and put it into our hand. So 1 card for each guild means that we could, in theory, get the magical Christmas land draw 10 off a single Niv trigger, but we're more likely to get 4 to 5 cards, which still restocks our hand quite nicely. Now, recently, a second Niv has been added to the deck to also give the list more reason to be Niv rather than Omnath to light now. Niv-Mizzet Supreme is a smaller body than Reborn, but has hexproof from monocolored. That means this dragon is immune to Go for the Throat, Tears of Valakut, and even the Wandering Emperor trying to take it down. It comes with another powerful ability on its flying body, giving all instant and sorcery cards that are exactly 2 colors in our graveyard Jumpstart. This means we pretty much get flashback for the added cost of discarding a card, so all of our spells in our deck get a second chance to be cast, making discard a lot weaker against our deck than it used to be. Before we get to the package of dual colored spells that our tutor and dragon tutors can find us, let's take a second to look at the cards that are included for other reasons, even though our list is pretty tight on theme in order to operate consistently. The first one we need to talk about is Omnath, Locus of Creation. Prior to and even after Niv-Mizzet Reborn was released, this deck was packing a full 4 of Omnaths and called Omnath to Light because of it. Although the Elemental isn't a 2-color combo card, the deck operated in a similar way when it was the main draw to packing 4 or more colors, so it stuck around and it's shown its power level over time. Omnath, now as a 3 of in most lists, draws a card when it enters, so flickering it with Yorion is something we can do for value, but the true potential lies in its 3-tiered landfall triggered ability. When you play a land, you gain 4 life. Not too shabby, especially against aggro decks. If you get another land to enter, say from a Fabled Passage, you get to add 4 mana to your mana pool, 1 of each color except for black mana. This is the biggest advantage to having Omnath, as it basically doubles your mana on curve and allows you to double or triple spell at the same time other decks are just getting around to playing their first big threat. And then lastly, if you get the third land into play somehow, Omnath also smashes your opponent and their planeswalkers in the face for 4 damage. The other card that can win you games despite not falling into the dual color theme of the deck is a card that gets played whenever Bring to Light gets brought up, Valki, God of Lies. Most of the time, you're not playing this godlike Deep Cavern Bat to steal a creature in hopes of becoming a Sheoldred, although that is an option. No, instead you're looking to cast the flip side of this trickster and favorite of the comment section for some reason, Tibalt, Cosmic Imposter. Because of the way Bring to Light is worded, when you search for a card, you are allowed to cast the card without paying its mana cost. So while Valki is chilling there waiting to be cast, you can cast either side of the card because of Bring to Light. So yeah, that means you can play your Tibalt for just 5 mana only, and only needing to converge for 2 colors to find Valki. From there, it's pretty easy to see how exiling your opponent's only threat or stealing away an extra card from them and quote-unquote drawing an extra card from your deck can quickly put the game out of reach. Also, don't forget that removing Tibalt doesn't shut off the emblem he gives you, so you can still play those stolen cards all game long. The main mana accelerant of the deck, and another card that isn't 2 colors, is Sylvan Caryatid. This hexproof, more expensive Birds of Paradise with a slightly bigger butt ensures that our deck has all colors of mana at its disposal as quickly as possible. Being able to jump the curve from 2 to 4 is big for landing in Omnath ahead of schedule, meaning we could potentially have 4 lands, 1 Caryatid mana, and 4 Omnath mana for a total of 9 as early as turn 4. Of course, playing Bring to Light on turn 4 where Converge is 5 isn't a bad plan either, and neither is playing a Niv ahead of schedule. Ancient Cornucopia has started to see play in lists as a 2 or 3 copy mana accelerant alongside Caryatid, with a big upside, gaining us life for every color a spell is when we cast it. For a majority of our spells, that's at least 2 life gained from the first spell we cast each turn, undoing many a pump and burn spell from aggro decks just by playing our main game plan. This can get as high as 5 colors thanks to Converge and Niv-Mizzets of all sorts, making it rough for decks to get under us. Up the Beanstalk makes its home in most Niv to Light lists as 4-ubs for the same reason it sees play in most formats. You're going to be casting large spells that trigger this to draw cards. In fact, playing Bring to Light for 5 mana to find another card for 5 mana is 2 triggers from Beanstalk, since you cast the card you find, not just put it into play. Likewise, Pioneer mainstay Fable of the Mirror Breaker is here as yet another way to generate some mana thanks to treasure tokens that our Goblin Shaman can make, but also for card filtering that it offers, finding us our needed Bring to Light or color of mana so that we can start chaining together haymakers. The flip side of Fable here actually gets very little value, as most of our creatures are going to be legendary, and you can't copy legendary creatures. Lastly, the most common monocolored card in the Niv-to-Light list is Leyline Binding, which take advantage of our 5-color mana base with Domain. Frequently as cheap as just 1 or 2 mana, Leyline finds its BFF up the beanstalk in yet another format to remove powerful opposing threats regardless of type and draw us a card at the very, very low mana investment. That brings us to the core construction of the deck, the dual colored cards. Since these lists feature a lot of one-ofs, I will try to cover a lot of what you'll see in lists with broad strokes and include some nitty-gritty details on optimized cards for specific matchups. There's also a broad category that these cards can be sectioned off into, so I'll start talking about like-minded cards in these bigger groups together. Starting off, let's look at the remaining creatures you might see in Niv-to-Light lists, as the ones we talked about only add up to about 10 or 11 altogether, which is fairly low for mid-range decks. Niv-to-Light in general is going to be on the lower creature side because we want to be able to find a lot of these spells that we pack. Lila, Undefeated Slickshot, is a new addition to the Niv-to-Light list, touting a 1 of each Izzet color mana cost and 1 generic mana. This 3/3 with prowess already loves a number of spells we have in our deck, so much so that they'd like to see them twice. If we cast an instant or sorcery from our hand, instead of putting the spell into the graveyard as it resolves, Lila says that we may plot the card instead. This means we can use it again next turn at sorcery speed. Bring to Light isn't the best here since we're not paying any mana on the plot side, so converge is 0, but all of our other spells will love this effect. Lila in combination with Niv Supreme give our one-of spells that normally need to be used at the right time new life, allowing for a one-of copy, instant or sorcery in our list to be used up to 3 times in a single game. Tolsimir, Friend to Wolves, has been in some lists for a long time as the 5 mana card represents a 6/6 spread across 2 bodies. Tolsimir creates the 3/3 Voja as an ETB trigger, gaining 3 life and the ability to fight another creature, effectively a 3 damage burn spell. Tolsimir also plays nicely with Yorion, flickering in and out to do it all over again. Quathis, God of Destiny, sits in some main decks as some hate on Phoenix and other graveyard-based synergies. Exiling a bird results in a 4 life total swing, blasting the opponent for 2 and gaining 2 in the process. Exiling a land card, be it our own or the opponent's, is going to net us a Gruul-colored mana of our choice, operating the same as if we had a Caryatid or a Cornucopia in play to ramp out a 5 mana threat as early as turn 4. Roxanne, Starfall Savant, is another new card from Outlaws of Thunder Junction that's been slotted into the Niv list, having both an ETB and a tax trigger to create meteorite tokens that deal 2 damage on entry and tap for 1 of any color of mana. Roxanne also helps us spit out multiple spells in a turn as they make our meteorite and our treasure tokens tap for 2 mana instead of just 1. Wandering Mind is one of the only non-legendary creatures you'll see in some of the Niv-to-Light lists, although it's not as common as the rest. When this 2/1 flying horror enters the battlefield, you can look at the top 6 cards of your library and find a non-creature, non-land card to put it in your hand. Sort of like a one-hit wonder collected company for our spells, helping find our silver bullets and dig for Bring to Light all at the same time earns this card a slot in some lists. Krenko's Buzz Crusher isn't dual colored, but sees play in some main decks as an answer to mostly the card Lotus Field, as it doesn't target the land so it can get around its hexproof ability. It has some small upsides against control lists or even like the mono black lists, as you can hit utility lands like castles and specifically creature lands. Creatures aside, the deck plays a decent number of board wipes as well, all in various amounts and various colors. One thing to note is that despite falling into the dual color category of cards, Supreme Verdict is currently absent from most of the Niv-to-Light lists floating around. To note, Verdict can't be countered, But most creature decks in the format aren't running counter magic as is, unless you're Spirits or Spell Pierce from Phoenix's main deck. Instead, Niv-Mizzet players are opting for board wipes with additional value effects, even if they're monocolored. Cards like Extinction Event and Sunfall have the upside of exiling the creatures, so cards like Arclight Phoenix and Amalia can't just come back later. Sunfall, of course, has the upside of making it an incubator token, which can account for us losing any creatures we had just a tiny little bit. Deadly Cover-Up also has popped up in lists as a 5-mana Wrath effect that doesn't exile, but does provide a Necromentia type effect to remove all the copies of a card in a graveyard so long as it's there and the evidence has been collected. Of note, the card Deadly Cover-Up removes doesn't have to be something it killed, so you can remove creatures you killed earlier, non-creature spells as well, and this includes cards like Lotus Field because there is no type restriction. Ill-Timed Explosion is a card from Murders at Karlov Manor that works as just not a board wipe via damage, but also draws us 2 cards in the process. For 4 mana, we can deal up to 5 damage to each creature, killing just about everything in the format that isn't an Archfiend of the Dross or Atraxa Grand Unifier. Discarding a spell isn't even that bad here thanks to Lila and Niv-Mizzet Supreme. Smaller spells that deal damage to everything on board also pop up quite frequently in Niv-to-Light lists, as most of the larger threats we play have 4 or greater toughness. Deafening Clarion is the big one we see, since it doesn't exile like Anger of the Gods or doesn't kill artifacts like Brotherhood's End. It is a dual-colored spell with the upside of giving our surviving creatures lifelink to really pound aggro decks in the dirt with advantage. Next up is the package of single target removal spells, where our dual-color theme really starts to hit home. This is also the section that can be the most varied in cards that see play, so if something isn't here that you've had success with, keep sticking to it. Otherwise, take some inspiration from what others are running here. Lightning Helix is the quintessential 2-color burn spell that recently got printed into the Pioneer format, getting rid of smaller sized creatures and buffering our life total at the same time. Abrupt Decay is a spell we haven't really seen in a little bit, but removes smaller threats and most notably kills things like Fable of the Mirror Breaker while being uncounterable. One knock against it is that it can't kill creature lands, so something that small cards like Fatal Push can do better is not applicable for Abrupt Decay. Vanishing Verse is a 2-mana Orzhov spell that deals with some of the biggest threats in the format for good thanks to the Exile clause. Cards like Arclight Phoenix, Wildgrowth Walker, Sheoldred the Apocalypse, both Sorin and Vein Ripper, and even the Wandering Emperor are all monocolored permanents that can be hit with a single verse. Molten Collapse is a modal removal spell in Rakdos colors that can synergize with our lands or cards like Fable in order to get both parts of it online, destroying any creature or planeswalker, and removing a non-creature, non-land permanent with mana value 1 or less. Usually this is just going to be used on the first mode, but in a pinch can remove something like Deafening Silence from the board. Kolaghan's Command is one of the better modal Rakdos cards that sees play in a multitude of formats, allowing for us to choose between damage to a creature or player, discarding a card from someone's hand, destroying an artifact, or returning a creature from our graveyard to our hands. So if something died, we could dome our opponents for 2 and grab back a Niv or Omnath in one fell swoop. This works well with Ill-Timed Explosion, buying us time to discard a 5-mana creature to wipe the board, then just getting it back with K-Command later in addition to doing something else. Consecrate Consume is an interesting addition to the deck, as one part of the card isn't exactly removal. Exiling a card from a graveyard is great against decks like Izzet Phoenix, and it replaces itself with a card draw effect, but the split side, however, gives us a blot out effect that for 1 extra mana also gains us life equal to the sacrificed creature's power. So using this as an answer to Vein Ripper actually nets us 4 life in the process, while also being a great way to deal with cards like Atraxa Grand Unifier or one of the Vaultborn Tyrants from creativity lists. Last but not least is a personal favorite of mine, even though it's one of the only cards that can actually be brought to light, bringed to light, it costs 6 mana, you get what I mean. Casualties of War is the ultimate removal spell, hitting an artifact, creature, enchantment, land, and planeswalker all at the same time. Although the card doesn't see much play due to the coveted 5-for-1 being extremely rare and hard to pull off, it is a great catch-all answer to 1 or 2 things from opposing decks. This last section of cards in the Niv-to-Light spell package I'm going to group together as quote-unquote utility cards, as they cover a few different effects. Let me show you what I mean. Soul Search is a 2-mana Thoughtseize effect that has the upside of both exiling the card it gets rid of and creating a 1/1 Flying Spirit if the card was 1 or less mana value. Great against Phoenix decks, this card also comes in clutch against control and combo decks as we're unable to run the traditional discard spells. Unmoored Ego sees both main deck and sideboard play as a catch-all answer to decks like Lotus Field and Amalia, while also being decent and taking out Arclight Phoenix or Vein Ripper if you have it in hand game 1. Very rarely a dead card, Ego is sure to have better applications versus some decks compared to others, but garners main deck slots due to the popularity of the ones that it is good against. The last card to mention, and probably one of the best additions to the Niv-to-Light deck recently, is the Outlaws of Thunder Junction sorcery, Pillage the Bog. A Golgari spell that lets you look at the top X cards of your library, where X is twice the number of lands you control, can dig deep quickly. The addition of plot to the card means you can always just stash it away for a later rebuild or keep it safe from discard effects. You can also use it to find your Bring to Light or Niv-Mizzet easily on turn 4 or 5 thanks to plot, digging 8 to 10 cards deep for 0 mana, and then follow it up with your 5 mana Namesake card. Oh boy. Now, lands in the Niv-to-Light deck are going to be a little harder to go over. Partly because it's a Yorion deck and is running 34 to 35 of them, and partly because everyone seems to have their own rendition of what the mana base should look like. Some pilots are running as many as 15 unique lands in their 34 or 35, while some lists are running up to 27 unique lands out of 34 or 35. Because of this, I'm mostly going to hit the broad strokes of the mana base rather than the exact specifics to save some time. The most important part of the deck is that we have all 5 colors accessible as quickly as possible. Due to our mana acceleration in our deck being green based, our land base is going to follow suit. That means while we are going to be running as many triomes as possible, it'll be the ones that tap for green mana that are going to be seen the most in multiples of like 3 or more. Secondly, we're going to want to make sure we hit red mana early for cards like Fable, Lila, and our removal spell package, so you can see additional copies of Sacred Foundry and Stomping Grounds in these lists as the shock lands. Lastly, we're going to want to be running at least one of each basic land in our mana base, mostly to ensure that we don't get destroyed by Field of Ruin effects, but also so we can take advantage of running 4 copies of Fabled Passage. The best possible land to run alongside Omnath, Fabled Passage works as a true fetch land for any basic land we have starting on turn 4 when the land enters untapped, and ensures that we can cast Omnath, Bring to Light, and our Niv-Mizzets right on time. The rest of the land base is really up to you. Most of the lists seem to be running at least 1 copy of Mana Confluence to make sure there is a 5-color producing land in a pinch, and some lists have added additional copies of Xander's Lounge to the list due to the uptick in Izzet cost cards with Lila and Ill-Timed Explosion being added to the deck. Aside from Stomping Grounds and Sacred Foundry though, you're going to be seeing most pilots opt for single copies of the Shocklands and up the number of triomes to 2 or more copies. This is not only ensuring domain easier for Leyline Binding and Converge for Bring to Light, but also means we can cycle away redundant copies of top deck mana in the late game to try to find an answer or threat instead. Whew! Now that the main deck is spoken for, let's tackle the even stranger soup that can be called the sideboard of the mid to light decks. Again, these are extremely varied from list to list, and due to the soupy nature of this toolbox deck, you're going to see variations depending on the metagame and the pilot was preparing for. Online lists will usually try to attack the field as a whole, while in-person events, especially those at an LGS or a local RCQ level, are going to be more teched for specific matchups they expect to encounter and kind of honed in on certain targets. I'm going to go through a bunch of different cards that players have cooked with, so there might be more than 15 cards I actually talk about here. Choose what makes the most sense when you're sleeving up your own 95 for your local meta or whatever event you're preparing for, and don't be afraid to adjust these cards from event to event, or even take some from the sideboard and put them in the main deck and vice versa. For starters, we have Yorion! Okay, that's a bit of a cop-out, but it's worth noting we're actually on a 14-card sideboard here thanks to our companion. Not too bad when we get the extra main deck slots though. Fatal Push does see some play, as aggro decks that stop our life gain can be a bit of a pain. Removing Slick Shot Show Off is crucial, so we bring in cheap effective removal for them. Dovin's Veto and Mystical Dispute are counterspells in our sideboard, as the deck does need some help against the combo decks of the format. Although we play ahead of our curve and can multi-spell quite quickly, we're still a pretty fair deck compared to ones like Lotus Field combo, so these cards are needed to fight them early to build up for our big turns later. Just like the counterspells, Cabal, Console of Allocation, is great at taxing combo decks and even has some game against the control lists. Blasting them for 2 life and giving us 2 life whenever they play a non-creature spell, Cabal can also be used against Phoenix, but its 3 toughness body is hard to keep around when all of their removal spells are capable of just killing it. To really hammer home how difficult the unfair decks can be for Niv to light, Notion Thief is run in some of these sideboards in order to shut down the drawing power of cards like Pore Over the Pages and make it impossible for blue decks to dig for the cards they need to fight us. Oh yeah, it steals the card draw and gives it to us instead, so we get to do the digging around here. Ashiok Dream Render shuts down the mirror match a bit as it turns off opposing Bring to Lights, but more importantly is great against Amalia, Lotus Field combo, and Izzet Phoenix. A single card hitting 3 top tier decks that is 2 colors is a must use for Niv. Pick Your Poison and Run Afoul have both seen play as Andrew's 2 Vein Ripper and Atraxa. While Pick Your Poison is modal and has the upside against other decks, Run Afoul is instant speed and the better option if you are strictly worried about the big flyers. Elder Gargaroth is a big, dumb, lovable monster that can't help but want to hug the crap out of aggro decks and break down the mid-range mirrors. A 6/6 body for just 5 mana means we can still get it off Bring to Light, all while using it in combat does one of 3 powerful effects, from gaining 3 life, to making a 3/3 body, to drawing us cards. Quakebringer is an anti-life gain card, mostly in the deck for the Amalia matchup, and its 5 mana cost means we can tutor it for it to stop a turn 4 combo if we're on the play. Although there are some dual colored giants out there, our list doesn't have any, so chances of the second part actually happening are entirely dependent on how many Quakebringers you run. Lastly, and probably my favorite part of these soupy decks, both in construction and video length, the rest of your sideboard cards can just be extra copies of your main deck Silver Bullets. Since we're running so many cards that are 1-ofs and 2-ofs in our main deck, we can take the best of the bunch and sideboard in extra copies while taking out the bullets that don't hurt whatever matchup we're in. Things like extra Abrupt Decays or additional Unmoored Egos are great to have around just in case you need them. Although you're going to have a lot of different situations pop up and many different tools for the job, there are still some basic play patterns that can make your Niv to Light list feel just a little unfair. I'll go over a few of your explosive starts and then talk about the more normal lines you might see in a game. For starters, your deck has 2 potential quote-unquote nut draws that do a couple of different things. There's the classic Bring to Light line, the pop-off Omnath, and just a normal value Niv draw. The classic Bring to Light line involves you playing a turn 1 tapped land into a turn 2 untapped land for Sylvan Caryatid, letting you play pretty much whatever you want on turn 3, and then casting Bring to Light on turn 4 to find Tibalt, Cosmic Imposter. This line gives you Turbo Tibalt and lets you have something like an Omnath on the field, or use something like Soul Surge to rid your opponent of a counterspell or removal effect to ensure you get your fast Planeswalker. From there, you can exile either the top cards of your decks for later use, or whatever threat your opponent has managed to play. Even if Tibalt dies, you got the emblem to allow you to cast the exiled spell for the rest of the game, or something else if you can trigger Omnath twice next turn. The quote-unquote pop-off Omnath line of play starts off very similar, only on turn 3, we 100% want to play our Omnath Locus of Creation. We then play a turn 4 Fabled Passage, crack it for a land that enters untapped, and now have access to 9 total mana to cast any number of spells in our hand. Omnath triggers with Fabled Passage gain us 4 life and generate 1 of each non-black colored mana to go with our 4 untapped lands and our Sylvan Caryatid. This then lets us say Niv-Mizzet Reborn to find a whole slew of cards and allows us to still cast any of them that are 4 mana or less. We can also Bring to Light for a Converge being X equals 5, finding any spell in our deck to cast 1 turn earlier than expected. Now, not a true nut draw, the value Niv draw was touched upon in the last scenario, where we tried to play a Niv-Mizzet Reborn as soon as turn 4. Even though Omnath on turn 3 helps this play be more than just big value, we can always substitute up the Beanstalk to draw a card while casting Niv, or Fable the Mirror Breaker so we can dig 2 cards deeper to find Bring to Light or a Niv, or even just hold up removal spells while we wait to deploy our dragon. So, while the deck does have some very explosive starts, they all hinge on having your 4 of Sylvan Caryatid in your opening hand or after your first draw step. This means the usual hands are going to be a little bit slower and will consist of draw, land, go for potentially the first 2 turns. Having an Up the Beanstalk is great to draw cards, and with the correct sequence of Triome Shockland can have Leyline Binding become a 1 mana removal spell that cantrips as early as turn 3. Otherwise, much like the soup deck that it is, the games will be a slow simmer as you set up for your extremely powerful pop-off turns thanks to your individual ingredients. Unlike other mid-range decks, our payoffs all restock our hand if they resolve, be it drawing cards when they enter, finding multiple cards from the top of our deck, or adding a draw into each spell as we cast them if they're large enough. Don't be afraid to take some damage to dig for those threats, including taking some damage in order to plot a Pillage the Bog. You're going to come out ahead in a lot of these fair matchups just by being the one to play multiple spells in a turn first, or being able to do it for multiple turns in a row. Because of the way the deck is constructed, you do have to be a little careful about what spells you're using and when, but with the redundancy of Lila and Niv Supreme, in addition to some multiple cards with similar effects in the list, you're not going to be punished too hard if you need to, say, use your Abrupt Decay to kill a Sorin even though they didn't put a Vein Ripper into play right away. The hardest part is going to be sequencing your mana and knowing when to pitch hands with bad lands in it. Just remember that our deck really wants to find green mana, and our land base is constructed in a way so that the lands of multiple colors often tap for green as well. So a hand with at least 1 green and 1 red source will allow you to cast a majority of our deck, and get you at least 4 different land types pretty quickly. You can also take some chances on keeping a 2 or 3 land hand without mana acceleration, as your Yorion deck with at least 34 lands in your list. That means you're 67.2% likely to draw your 3rd land by turn 3 on the play, and 80.2% likely to draw the 4th land by turn 4 on the play. The catch to this is that you do have lots of lands that enter tapped, so that doesn't mean you're always curving out with your spells, even if you hit your land drops. Niv to Light is in a great position for the current online representation of the Pioneer metagame, as the deck matches up extremely well into a lot of the top tier decks. As you are a mid-range deck that can mid-range harder, faster, stronger than any other of the decks out there, you have great matchups against Izzet Phoenix, both the classic and vampire flavors of Rakdos. You also absolutely sleep the Waste Not deck, as you have way too many ways to outvalue them and kill them while doing so. Your spell package makes you slightly favored against a lot of the aggressive decks, but it's not always a free win. With a good start, Boros Heroic, Boros Convoke, Mono Red, and Atarka Red will all have a hard time getting through your Caryatid, Omnath, Niv plus spell backup. But if you have a slower start, they can sneak in lethal damage by the time you're stocking your hand. If you know you're against one of these decks, try to keep a hand with blockers and removal for the first few turns and pitch a slower average start hand. Now, I've alluded to it in the earlier contents of the video, but the matchups that are rough for Niv to Light involve combo and control decks. Combo decks just do their thing faster than you can hope to do in game 1, and a lot of your counter magic is in your sideboard. Your best bet here is against Amalia combo, as they need creatures on the board to do their thing, and your removal works well here, save for Vanishing Verse, which actually can't touch Amalia herself. Lotus Field combo is one of your worst matchups, as you play the board and rarely attack their hand the way that black-based mid-range decks can do. Likewise, Azorius Control is a harder matchup, as they have all the permission in the matchup, and we lack the right disruption spells to really make a dent. Some games we can overwhelm them with threat after threat after threat, drawing cards off of Cast Trigger from Beanstalk. But a lot of the games we play are going to be on the struggle bus, as if they answer the first threat, we don't have the velocity or the ability to find the follow-up ones. Niv to Light is one of those very intimidating deck lists because of the 95 slots from Yorion that looks extremely complicated, but when you get to playing it, you realize there are some pretty common lines that you can take and some real strong openers that help a lot when you're starting out learning the deck. I mentioned earlier the biggest thing is going to be sequencing your lands and knowing what cards in your hand to keep and when to mulligan them away. So I would suggest playing a lot of games with the deck if you're brand new, just to make sure you learn what to do with all these different cards that can be in your opening hand. Because the deck has so many one-ofs and potential modifications you can make, you really need to put time into the deck to make sure you understand why cards are there in the first place before you go start changing things around. This is because you may wind up diluting your deck too much, getting frustrated and quitting playing the deck for the perceived wrong reasons. Things like, this deck is bad and I can't beat this specific matchup, when you may have actually taken those cards out for some pet cards or cards that you think are good that you didn't really understand the full potential of in the main deck. I'd suggest playing enough matches with the deck to play against each of the top 5 decks you'd expect to see more than once, which, like rough estimates with some of these decks being like 6% of the field, could happen within roughly 30 matches. So like 6 online MTGO leagues, or going to your local game store for an F&M or some sort of Pioneer evening for about a month or so. Even experienced mid-range pilots, this deck is going to differ from the style of Rakdos or Golgari decks enough to warrant some extra testing time. However, if you're coming from Modern and have played the 4 and 5 color soup decks in that format, you can probably pick up on some of the lines of this deck a lot easier, as the card pool is smaller, the cards are a little less powerful, and some of the cards actually overlap, so you already have an understanding of how the deck ticks. So, what do you think about the soup of the day? Are the ingredients to your liking, or are you looking at the menu for something a little more your flavor palette in Pioneer? Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and while you're down there, if you've liked this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up, because that helps with the algorithm overlords for me. Don't forget, while you're here, to tap that subscribe button to stay up to date on the latest deck techs, metagame analysis, and just in general, magic content from me. See you later.